Hello and welcome back to QubaHQ tutorials. My name is Kuba Michalski and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Floaties, a new text animator preset for After Effects available free from QubaHQ.com. And let's pause right here, get into proper After Effects view and quickly explain to you what Floaties is. Very often you're going to build a scene either 2D or 3D in After Effects, position your elements, move the camera around, and everything looks good, but the scene somehow lacks definition. That's when very often people resort to placing some small particulate matter in the scene, being it either little dust specks, like you can see on this screen, or some sort of glowing, sparkly particles. Floaties is going to help you generate this kind of effect using After Effects built-in text animators. Now, truth be told, if I was presented with such task, I would probably use Trapcode Particular myself. It's a fantastic, very quick plugin, and creating this kind of effects takes just a minute or so. It also renders really quickly, especially compared to the Floaties, which tend to be a bit of a render hog, especially if you don't have a very powerful machine. Trapcode Particular, however, is currently sold at $400 price point, and I thought it would be nice to have a free alternative available to those of you who may not want to invest this kind of money or resort to piracy. So why don't we just jump right in and see what Floaties is capable of, how to set it up and how to use it. With this tutorial on my website you're going to find a download link. It's going to be also available in the description below the Vimeo and YouTube copies of this tutorial, and once you download it and unzip it, you're going to find a folder called Type Toolset. Now you need to place this folder inside of your After Effects user presets, and the presets are compatible with version CS3 and above. I'm using 5.5 in here. So inside of the Type Toolset, on my folder you can see Splatter Type, which is part of an earlier tutorial. You will find QubaHQ Floaties FFX, as well as a presets folder containing 6 starter presets that can get you some ideas of how to creatively use this thing. I already have the preset installed on my computer, so I can close the Explorer and navigate directly to Effects and Presets and simply type QubaHQ. Well, maybe that's not such a good idea because that opens all the presets I created for different tutorials. Let's just write Float, and that's going to open Floaties. So QubaHQ Floaties, the base preset, and 4 starter sets with cool effects. Let's close this preview video and start fresh. Delete it. Okay, so let's start by creating a new composition, and I'm going to just use 720p at 25 frames a second. 30 seconds is way too long. Let's shorten it to, let's say, 10 seconds maximum, and have a look at applying Floaties. Now, without any layer selected, and that's pretty important because especially if you have a previous text layer as your selection, things can go a bit wrong. So without any layer selected, we double click QubaHQ Floaties, and that's going to process for a moment and then create new text layer. And what you're going to see is a whole bunch of controllers. Now, I'm gonna be frank with you, I nicked some of them from the splatter type. I used the same logic but enhanced the preset and added some new functions to it. Unfortunately, when you first apply the preset, you will see that all the controllers are going to be selected, and this is something that presets in After Effects just do. So what you need to do is simply click away from the layer, select it again, and now you're free to do any modifications. So right off the bat, if we just render the preview, let's just shorten it a little bit. 4 seconds would be more than enough. If we render the base setup, we're just going to see a swarm of little dots flying around in a random fashion, or rather semi-random fashion. So this is your starting point. This is where you can evolve your effect from. What kind of controls do we have? I'm going to hide the helpers in here so we can see the dots better. Maybe even zoom in a little bit. Yeah, and let's reset all the settings to to 0. So I'm just going to go around. I'm going to leave size at 5 pixels and opacity at 100, but 0 all the other settings such as movement amount, movement frequency, and sparkle frequency. Alright, so the first thing we may want to do before we even touch any of the controllers is to change the name of the layer. Now at the moment you can see it's just a bunch of dots, and this is the actual text content of the layer. Those are the dots that are going to become the particles, and unfortunately the presets in After Effects don't allow you to define a custom name for the layer. So let's just quickly retype QubaHQ Floaties 01 onto this one, just for the clarity so we see where we're at. So the first setting that we have in here is the amount, and that's going to control how many dots or particles we're going to see on the screen. The number can be from 0 to 1000, and that's because too many of the particles on a single layer really slow down After Effects to the crawl. I mean, you can type a number higher than 1000, but it's not going to generate more than 1000 particles per layer. If you want more, simply create another layer, copy the settings, and change the random seed. We're gonna talk about it a bit later. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to use around 100 particles, and that should leave us with a composition that renders fast enough but at the same time shows what happens with larger groups of particles animated at the same time. And as we apply it, you may see that indeed a dot appeared in the middle of the screen. Now you may ask why there is only one dot and not 100. Well, that's because we did not spread the particles yet, so all 100 of them are sitting in precisely the same spot. Actually, before I start going on to the spread and other settings, I'm just going to quickly talk about the size. So let's lower the amount to single particle and increase the size to, let's say, 15 pixels. So the size is measured in pixels, and it's very precise, so you can adjust it to match all the other elements you may have in the scene. As you can see, if I create a new solid that's 15 by 15 pixels, it's going to be exactly the same size as our dot. Let's actually put it underneath. There may be a little bit of difference, but this is due to anti-aliasing. Of course, once you start using the 3D properties and some of the dots will start coming closer to the screen or further away, they will appear to be bigger or smaller, but this allows you to have very precise control over how big those particles are. Let's change it back to, let's say, 6 pixels and go on to the spread thing. So I'm increasing the amount back to 100, and spread is pretty much self-explanatory. Spread XY is going to decide how big your particle field is in terms of width and height, and spread Z or Z is going to decide how deep it is, so how close or far away from the camera it becomes. I'm gonna set it at 300 for each of them, and you can see right now we spread them horizontally, vertically. Right now it's a 2D field. Let's actually quickly create a new camera in here. And in here the preview is going to be very slow, so you're going to just have to trust me on this one. But if I right now rotate it, you can see that this is a flat field. All the particles are sitting on the same plane. And if we increase the spread in Z to 300, we're getting a proper 3D field. Alright, okay, that's fairly simple. I'm gonna delete the camera because we're not really going to be dealing with it. And as I did so, let me undo it and redo it. You can see that the alignment of the particles changes. And that's because they are using random numbers in After Effects. And as you may have learned from earlier tutorials, all the random numbers take the index of the layer as one of the seeds for the generation. So if I put anything above this layer, the random numbers are going to change and the alignment is going to become different. I mean, let's quickly create a null object above, and you can see we have a completely different seed right now. Delete it, it comes back to this setting. So this is something to be aware of, especially if you're trying to control the spread of your particles in a very, well, particular way. But for this demonstration, it doesn't really make any difference. Alright, so that's amount, spread, and size in the bag. Let's go to size random. So size random is basically going to allow you to create some variety in the size of the particles. And it operates on the percentage scale from 0 to 100 relative to the size of the original particle. So if I was to set the size to 10 and the size random to 100, we're going to have the particles ranging in the size from 0 pixels, being invisible, to 20 pixels, which is 10 plus 10, 100% more than it is. If I set it to, let's say, 50, we're going to get much more moderate variation. And I think the settings that are going to look good in here would be 5 and let's say 30. So a little bit of difference, but nothing major. Next we have opacity. Well, it already selected itself. Again, we have two controllers. We have opacity and opacity random. Opacity defines the transparency of the particles at birth. So if I was to change it to, let's say, 50 pixels, all of them would change their opacity. Now, you may see that some of them may appear brighter than the others, but that's because they're simply overlapping. So if I zoom in here, you will see that that brighter spot is created indeed by two separate particles sharing the same space. At this point, I think it would be good to talk a little bit about blending modes and how After Effects works with the blending modes in this particular scenario. So let's change opacity back to 100. I know I'm jumping around the settings a little bit, but I think this way we can cover all the little details without missing anything. Let's increase the size to, let's say, 20 so that we create more overlaps. And I'm going to change the color of the particles to, let's say, blue. Alright, so what should I do? I should actually add another layer underneath, make it comp size, and actually I can use the very same blue color for that underneath. Okay, so if I change the mode of this layer to add, it's going to do two things. First of all, it's going to apply add for the layer. So the way these particles blend with the background are in additive mode. And if I change to screen, we should see some sort of difference. Yes, they're much more faded. I like using add, especially for the glowy things. But there is another thing happening. We can delete the background right now, which is each of those particles is by itself in additive mode. So as they overlap, this is also taking the add mode under consideration. So again, if I change it to screen, you will see that those overlaps are not quite so strong. And if we go to add mode again, we get those really strong light boosts. So basically you can think about it as if each of those dots is treated as its own separate 3D layer, each set to add mode. Okay, back to what we were talking about. White color, size back to 5, and let's keep on going. So we have the global opacity and we have opacity random, and that allows you basically to introduce some more variation. So again, it goes from 0 to 100. If we set it at 100, we'll see that we have the particles ranging all the way from totally transparent to fully opaque. And now, depending on the global opacity, this variation will change as well. If we go all the way to 0, we're not going to see anything because that's our seed. So 25, a group of particles, randomized, blah blah blah. Okay, back to 100. And I'm gonna change the randomness to, let's say, 20. So most of them are purely white and some of them are slightly more dimmed. Next we have blur, and yet again, guess what? Two controllers, global blur and blur random. But this time we also have blur random frequency, and this is where the animation controls are starting to kick in. Now, you can animate all those properties by keyframing them, but whenever you see the frequency or the movement amount and stuff like that, those are the automated animators that are going to allow you to define the speed of the movement and the speed of different effects taking place. So let's have a look at what blur does. I don't think it's much of a surprise it's going to blur the particles. So if I set it to something like 5, it's probably going to be a total overkill. Yep. But we're getting the blurry particles. If I set it to something like 0.5, we're just going to get slightly feathered particles, so they're not quite so harsh. Again, I think increase of the size in here would do us some good. So you can see that the edges are quite soft right now. If I change it to 1, they're becoming much sharper, much more defined. 1. That's fairly nice. I think I was happy with 0.5. Then we have blur random, and this works exactly the same as size random or opacity random. It's basically going to introduce extra variation to the blur, but this time it's not relative to the blur. So if I type a value like 10, it's basically going to create the blur all the way from 0 to 10 randomly. If I run a preview right now, you will see that we're still operating within a static composition. Nothing is changing. The timeline marker is moving forward, but our particles are static. So let's go into the properties that control animation right now, starting with blur random frequency. All the animated randomizers in this preset operate using very simple wiggle selectors in text animation, and we're gonna look under the hood of this preset a bit later, but that means that we animate them using frequency, meaning how many times a second will the value change. So if I set it at 2, each of the particles is going to assume 2 different blur values per second. So if I preview it right now, we're going to see some quite rapid changes. Let it just preview for a moment, and we can see it switching. Now for subtle effects, you'll probably want to set it at some really low value. I usually like to go with 0.1 or 0.2, so a single change happens over the course of 10 or 5 seconds. But to demonstrate it, I just didn't want you to have to sit and wait through the long preview. It's enough that I'm taking forever explaining these presets. I'm gonna change it to 0 for now, because I don't really want any animation happening on the blur as we're showing other settings, and I'm gonna change blur random to just 2, so there is a little bit of less of it happening. Actually, you know what, let's get rid of the blur altogether. It's going to speed up the previews. What do we have next? Movement amount and movement frequency. So this is similar to the turbulence field setting in Trapcode Particular. If we increase it, it will allow each of those particles to move freely in a certain area. So if I set it to, let's say, 25 pixels, well, nothing happens first. Whoops, because I applied it to blur random frequency, of course. If I set it to 25, you will see them jump, but jump only once, because movement frequency is at 0, so no movement is taking place. But if I increase it to, let's say, once a second, you will see that each of those particles travels in its box of 25 by 25 by 25 pixels. That affects X, Y, and Z axis, and basically we get a bit of more random movement. Let's lower the setting to, actually we can increase the movement amount but lower the frequency to 0.1 to create a little bit more of a liquid feel with the particles slowly floating around. Yeah, that's looking just about right. And jump to the next setting, which is sparkle. Sparkle amount, sparkle frequency. Again, same logic as with other controllers. Sparkle amount will add changes in opacity over time. So if you think about opacity random, this is a setting that gets applied per particle and does not change over time. Sparkle amount will allow those particles to flicker faster or slower as you prefer it. So I'm going to set sparkle amount at 100, so pretty heavy. And unless I change the frequency, this is going to be just a static value. So again, if I preview it, we have the movement happening, but each particle retains its opacity. But if I right now increase the frequency of sparkling to, let's say, once a second, we're going to see some changes in their opacity happening. And right now you're probably already starting to see how powerful this tool is. Now, yes, it renders slow as hell, but you can create some really nice things. And actually, sparkle frequency is something I added towards the very end of developing it, and it totally changed the way I started looking at the whole preset. So if you do the slow one, this kind of simulates, simply opacity changing as if they are suspended in the liquid, and it works really well with higher blur amounts. So if I increase the blur to, let's say, 2, 5 random, and frequency of 1 on the blur, we're going to start seeing some really nice effects. Yes, this looks good. But also 0, 0, 0, we can drive it really high. So if we put it at, let's say, 6 changes per second, we're gonna create sort of a glitter look. So if you think of, golden glitter floating around, this simulates this effect pretty well. So again, through the frequency, you can achieve some cool effects in here. Let's turn off the sparkles right now. And what else do we have? Of course, we have the random seed. So random seed affects all the settings that we covered so far. So if I, let's say, introduce the blur random yet again at frequency of 1, let's increase the size random to, let's say, 60. The spread will be affected. What else we have in here? Movement frequency. Okay, nah, I'm not gonna add sparkling. But basically, if for any reason you're not happy, opacity random 60, 100. What the hell? All right. If for any reason you're not happy with the way this thing looks, you can simply change the random seed, and it's going to generate the new set of animations for all of the settings. And you may see that although everything is supposed to be random, we can see some sort of patterns emerging. For example, it appears that all the particles on the left became much smaller, all the ones on the right became bigger. And that's just the nature of the noise generated by the wiggle expression. So you just have to keep on trying until you find something that you're satisfied with. This, for example, looks pretty nice. And again, all the animation works, all the settings that we've set remain the same, it just uses a different random seed to generate the effect. Onwards to the color settings. And this is a bunch of controllers, I have to admit. I pretty much copy-pasted from the splatter type preset. I mean, I did a small rewrite on the code just to make it a bit more efficient, but they worked fine there, so I see no reason to change it. So again, you can set your base color. Let's set it at some sort of relatively dark red. And I think it would be good to remove the random opacity so that we can see all the particles in the same color, and also get rid of the blur frequency we don't need. They can maintain the movement. And you can see that since we're still in the add mode, the overlaps are still creating these brighter areas. So that has nothing to do with the opacity. It's just the overlapping of a color that is slightly darker than the default hue value. Okay, so we have hue variation, and if you set it at 100, that's going to create every single color imaginable. If you set it at something low like 5, it's going to introduce just a bit of a variation to your base color. And I usually like to set it to maximum of 10, to create a really nice unified field of colors. We have, okay, let's expand it so we can read it. We have the brightness variation. Guess what does this control? The brightness of the particles. And you can't really see it well because that's what happens when they're all the way here. Let's pick the color that's a bit more dimmed. And right now you can see the difference between brightness variation of 0 and brightness variation of 100. I think the fact that I only typed 10% had something to do with it as well. But you can see, I mean, right now the brightness changes a lot, and it may look quite similar to changing the opacity, but right now all the particles are fully opaque. They just change their color value. Okay, brightness to 0, or brightness variation to 0, and then we have saturation variation. So again, if I put it at 100, we're going to see that some of the particles became much more saturated, and some of them went almost all the way towards white, becoming desaturated. So again, let's set that red color that we had earlier, and you can see right now fully saturated ones, fully desaturated ones, and so on. And finally, let's increase this as well. And finally, we also have the random seed for the color. Just like in splatter type, let's say you're happy with the arrangement of the particles, but not quite satisfied with the way that the color got distributed. Change the random seed, and you will see things changing around. So this actually looks quite nice. All the animators still work. So this is Floaties in a nutshell. A set of animators, and right now what I'm going to show you is some of the presets I created for it. I'm not going to go in depth about how they were created. With the exception of 2, actually all of them are made by just changing the values. And then, if I recall correctly, Cyan Bubbles and Gold Fireworks additionally have some keyframes that generate cool animation. So let's have a look at different applications. City lights. This is actually the preset I used in the preview video, and it works best when you change the mode to add, so that you get the nice boost. If you have a monster of a computer, you can also change the rendering mode to 23 bits per 32 bits per channel. And basically this simulates a kind of bokeh out of focus look. Keep in mind, those presets also obey the camera depth of field. So you can use either the built-in blur that's available inside of the controllers, or keep them sharp and control it through the depth of field settings in the camera. And especially in After Effects 5.5, you can define the aperture shape, and it generates some really nice results. So City Lights is basically still rendering. Yeah, it's basically something like that. I mean, you should really consider these names to be just what inspired me to do those presets. This will not create realistic looking cityscape, but if I think about, you know, night photography in the city with a lot of out of focus, this is something that you may see in the background of a photograph. Delete this thing, go to Cyan Bubbles. Cyan Bubbles, now that's a fun little preset. Let me just quickly check the keyframes on it. If I remember correctly, now you can start seeing all the crazy expressions that do this. If I remember correctly, I animated it to last for 5 seconds. And what I did in this one is, instead of using the color controllers and all the settings within the I forgot to. I stopped the render for some reason. Okay, let's just have a look at it and then I'll explain what it does or how it's made. Alright, so these are, well, bubbles. So what I did is I used the character controls in here and turned off the fill color and turned on the stroke color. So instead of dots, we're rendering circles. Applied a kind of cyan color to it, and again it will probably look much better in add mode, and generated some random blur, non-animated, added a bit of movement wiggle, and additionally added some expressions on the position and anchor point of the layer to animate it from the bottom to the top of your composition size. So the nice thing about this preset is it's going to read how big is your composition and generate something that fits it. So if I create a new comp right now and let's say go into PAL-DV square pixel and apply cyan bubbles, the size of the box is going to change and the thing will still take 5 seconds to almost pass the screen. So I did that because most of the compositions I do are in 720p, and I know a lot of people are using full HD 1080 and wanted to make sure that they don't end up with unwanted results. Alright, so that was bubbles. Let's have a look at what else we have. We have gold fireworks, and this is probably the most complex of the presets I created. So this one has, let me just zoom it in here. This one has quite a few presets, quite a few keyframes. So we're animating the amount of particles, we're animating the spread, we're introducing the flicker after a while, we're moving the whole layer around, and it generates a kind of firework looking thing. Actually, what I should have done is, first of all, let's delete it. Okay, so I managed to crash After Effects. Apparently I had too many cores selected at the same time and it was conflicting with the recording software. While I was out, I changed the mode to add, turned on motion blur, and this is what gold fireworks looks like. So basically a burst of particles and then they're slowly falling down, flickering and fading out. That's this setting. Let's turn off motion blur because that's a killer. Green swarm, again, works best in additive mode. This basically is a random swarm of green dots floating around. So you can imagine it to be some sort of insects. I mean, it's kind of similar to one of the presets that you can find in Particular, perhaps being useful for whatever reason, or if not, you can build something from it. Next we have, okay, we're gonna skip microdust right now, just go to pink sparkler, and that's a bit similar to the green swarm, only more static, and I'm working more with the changes in color with much less movement between particles, and this simulates that kind of glitter look that I talked about earlier. So that's the pink sparkler. And finally we have microdust, and why I said let's leave microdust to later is because that's the only one that does not look very well on black background. In fact, it looks like nothing on black background because the particles in it are black. So let's quickly introduce a new solid to the background, make it some sort of light gray color. Actually, just so that it looks better, we can even create a ramp on it. Something from, let's say, white to middle gray and back to floaties. Let's add microdust. Okay, and you may recognize this from the preview video. This is the exact preset I used for the first scene on the preview video, and this is probably the most frequent application of this kind of preset, just creating some sort of particulate matter floating freely in the air, giving our scene a bit of a 3D feel. So those are the settings, and at this point you can just download the preset, install it, and start going at it. For those of you who are a bit more technically inclined, I'm going to now dissect the preset and show you a little bit of the inner workings of how this whole thing is constructed. Alright, so let's apply the standard floaties just as they come. Arrange our timeline to be more visible, and let's have a look at what's happening inside. So basically everything, as I said, is done using text animators, and they are named pretty clearly, so you can easily understand what's happening and how does the effect work. The first thing that I want to show you is the 3D toggle. By default, Floaties is a 3D preset, so all of the dots are rendered in 3 dimensions, but you can very easily disable it, and that's going to speed up the render quite a lot. So depending if you're moving the camera through a 3D space or using it in 2D, you can decide on your own how you want to have it set. To disable it, simply go to Enable per character 3D and turn off the 3D behavior of the layer. So at this point, basically all the Z spread is no longer going to have any effect on the layer. You can see I'm changing it to some huge value and it's not doing anything. If I switch it back on to per character 3D, we can see that 3D spread taking place. You may also notice that as I turn it off, the entire layer turns into a 3D layer. Again, your choice. You can keep it as a 3D layer that's flat or turn it off. What do we have next? Path options and more options. These are all the default settings of any text animator. And we start with the setup. So setup basically generates all the base thing for this effect. So we have our base opacity, and that feeds directly. Let's rearrange these things a little bit in here so we can see it better. That feeds directly from our original opacity. So as I change it, this is the default birth opacity, and the fill color, which actually I don't think is linked to anything in here. Yeah, it is. No, it is. Okay, so this basically feeds off our color. I mean, it's been a while since I started coding this thing, so I may be a bit rusty figuring out what exactly have I done in there. So let's set the opacity back at 100. If I can find it, there it is. So this is the setup, the basic thing, deciding what's the basic look of the particle. Next we have the opacity random. This feeds off our random opacity animator, and it's using a simple wiggly selector that decides on how that randomness gets applied. So as we change it, you can see that opacity in here drop down to 0, so that it creates a difference from the original 100, and also the minimum amount is being controlled. I found out that if I keep it at the default value of 100 minus 100, when we have fully opaque particles and we introduce this randomness, it generates too many of the bright ones, so that's why it is done this way. Well, next we have sparkler. That basically feeds off our sparkle controls, sparkle amount and frequency. And again, most of it is very simple connections. So I mean, you can see wiggles per second just connects to the sparkle frequency. Maximum amount feeds from the maximum amount on the presets. Additionally, in here, actually in opacity random already, I'm starting to introduce random seed, and what I'm doing is I take it from the global random seed and offset it by a different number per effect. This way I can make sure that each of those randomness settings evolves independently. If they were all using the same random seed and we, let's say, introduced random blur, size and movement, the particles would at the same time change their opacity, change their size, blur in unison. What I wanted to do is make sure that each of those random values is generated separately. That's where this +20 comes from. And in here you can also adjust it manually if you feel like it. Next we have the amount. An amount basically is a range selector deciding how many particles we have on the screen. Now, you cannot define the amount of dots in the text using expressions, but what you can do is hide some of them. So basically we have 1,000 dots, but only 100 of them are visible. If I increase this amount to 1,000, we're going to I typed 100 again. We're going to see all of the particles, and actually you can even select all of them and see what happens as we change the value. Let's change the value to actually 10 and select all of them, and you see right now much fewer are visible, but we still have 1,000 particles or 1,000 dots in the text itself. Okay, back to 100. What's the next setting? That's the scale, and this is the global scale, and it has some slightly messed up math, and that's because I had to figure out how to scale it exactly depending on the font size. And the font I'm using for this setting is Times New Roman. That's because this is a typeface that pretty much every computer has, and its full stop sign is a perfectly round circle. Next we have box spread, and that's basically a wiggly selector with the position. It animates the two dimensions independently and spreads it according to the width and height. And actually, since I disabled per character 3D, it was only doing the two things. If I open it up right now, box spread, we're gonna see all three values set accordingly to what we wrote. Now you may notice that in here it says 150, while we clearly defined 300. That's because again we're using wiggle expression to spread those dots around, and we're using maximum +100 and minimum -100. So this is the half of the value we typed in that gets multiplied through the wiggle. Size random, well, pretty much the same thing. Feeds of the controller, hue variation, brightness variation, and saturation. Those have a bit of a stranger settings, and that's because I had to use the linear clamp on it just to make sure that if people push the value a bit too high, it's not gonna mess everything up. Blur and feather, that's the same thing. And finally you have motion X, Y, and Z. And in here again you may notice that I spread these three values into separate controllers, and that's again because I wanted to make sure that our random seed is different for each of the values. So if I expand it right now, God, what a mess. I have no idea if what I'm saying right now is organized in any way and if it makes any sense, but hopefully listening to me and then checking the project by yourself, you're gonna get the inner workings of this plugin. So I do two things in order to make sure that they spread differently in all three axes. First, I change the random seed, and second, I change both the temporal and the spatial phase. So you can see that in here we're at 0 degrees for both of them, in here 120 degrees, and in wiggly selector 240, and the random seed of 12. Alright, that was that was probably the worst explanation I ever made. But I think that's pretty much it. That is the Floaties in a nutshell. A set of quite powerful controls for the text animators that take forever to calculate, but replace a single function. Let's not say they replace the plugin, but they replace a single function of Trapcode Particular. So if you just need to create this single effect, I think it's a nice free option to have, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. Now, there is something I would like to propose to all of you watching this tutorial, especially the ones who are thinking about using this preset seriously. As I'm distributing it right now, it comes with 6 presets. And I think that's a fair amount for a free product that you can download without any charge. If you're planning to use it, and if you're going to create cool new effect or cool new animation using this preset, send me a copy of your project file. Or if you know how to create the preset file, send me a preset. This way we could start building the library, and I would be adding the new presets into the zip file that's distributed with this project, so each new user can benefit from what the community creates using Floaties. I don't know how many of you are eager to go beyond what's presented in here, but if you do something that you think is cool, go ahead and share it with the rest of the people, and perhaps if everything goes well, somebody is going to download Floaties a month or 2 months from now and find themselves with 100 presets rather than just the 6. I cannot offer you any monetary compensation for such work. All I can do is include your name in the preset, but I think it would be pretty cool to create such a library and basically see how far we can push the boundaries of what text animators in After Effects can do. So if you would be interested in doing something like that, simply email me. And I'm typing and nothing can be seen, probably because I set the color to white and chose a really strange font to be red with a really bad kerning. Okay. So this is my email, kuba@QubaHQ.com. Now it would be fantastic if you do this preset in CS3, but if you have the later version, feel free to do it in whatever you got. I can quickly duplicate it and convert it to CS3. If you do the preset in other language perhaps, now expressions don't translate very well. Unfortunately the preset I'm distributing will only work with the English version of After Effects. So if you want to take on the translation of the expressions, that would be something cool. Basically give back to the community. If you find a moment of time, I can tell you all these presets were created in less than an hour, so I don't think it should take you much more time to do something new and interesting. Now for a little bit of shameless self-promotion. First of all, I would like to welcome you to visit my website at QubaHQ.com. When you view the posts in here, +1 them, share them, tweet about it. Let others know that the site exists. Help them reach these tutorials and get informed about the cool stuff that can be done in After Effects. If you're feeling particularly generous, well, there is a donate button. You can donate to my PayPal account. Every little bit helps. I'm running this site from my own money, not generating much of an income. It's not my goal, but if you feel like it, I wouldn't say no. Next, if you're watching this tutorial on YouTube, click the like button. It only takes a second, but it helps improve the ratings of the tutorial and brings me a bit closer to the status of YouTube partner, when I could start making actual profit from the ads that run on the sides of the channel. It wouldn't mean your videos are getting interrupted in any way. It would simply put a little bit of box with an ad on the side panel, and the revenue would be shared between me and YouTube. What else you can do? You can subscribe to my channel on YouTube. That will get you notified about all the new releases, whether I make a new tutorial or release a commercial piece, and again bring my content a bit higher in the search results. If you're viewing it on the Vimeo, feel free to subscribe to QubaHQ tutorials channel. Again, all my tutorials can be found there. As you can see, there is 95 total subscribers at the moment. Not as many as I would like to see, but those people are already getting all the content on day one. Also, the little like button. It only takes 1 click, but it helps me promote my content and make it available to more people. All those little actions that many people forget about help. I mean, I often forget to like the content on either of the sites. All of these little actions help me get more recognition, help me get more promotion, and as the result, give me time and motivation to create more content for QubaHQ. Okay, next tutorial, I can't tell you yet what it's going to be about. It's going to be something fun, but I'm waiting for a certain video on YouTube to reach 10,000 views, and at that point I'm going to reveal what the tutorial is about and basically produce the content. The video is not on my channel, so don't look for it there. But if you can access my favorites, you can probably find it there. I'm just not sure if I made it public. I want to see how the world responds to that video without any external promotion, so that's why I'm not giving you the address right here. Okay, I feel like we've gone for long enough. I hope you're going to enjoy QubaHQ Floaties. For QubaHQ, I'm Kuba Michalski, and I'll see you next time.